right, I will go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Springtime Seminar Series. This series is a collaboration between Illinois Extension and the Interdisciplinary Health Science Institute at the University of Illinois, and it's designed to connect those across the state with researchers at the university to provide evidence-based educational programming. And we're kind of changing up things this week. I'm actually rather than an extension employee, I'm one of the coordinators for the program. My name is Corinne Cannavali. You guys might have, if you've tuned into a series in the past, you might recognize me from some of those. I am a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Illinois, and I've worked with Shelby Key, our presenter, for the last 3 years. I have broad interested works related to health behaviors and cognitive functioning. And so it's really exciting to be here and share all this with you guys. I'm going to have Dee go ahead and launch a poll to collect some basic information from our participants. Once you enter the information, feel free to just minimize it off your screen. It will we'll keep this up for the remainder of the session, just to account for anybody that joins in a little later on. And if you have questions during the program, feel free to put them in the chat box. I'll be keeping an eye on them. And I will find a good time either during the webinar or at the very end to ask those questions. And if you're tuning in via a call rather than on the computer, if you could hold your questions until the end, and I can unmute you in order to do those questions at that point. And so without further ado, I'll introduce the speaker for today. It's Shelby Key. Shelby Key is a third-year PhD student in the Department of Kinesiology and Community Health at University of Illinois. She completed her Bachelor of Science in Human Nutrition, Food, and Exercise in 2017 at Virginia Tech, and her Master's in Exercise Science in 2019 at UMass Boston. She currently studies the effects of physical activity and exercise on cognitive and motor function in children, and today she'll be presenting some information and leading discussion about the latest research on physical activity opportunities in children. And I will go ahead and pass things off to you, Shelby.
Thank you. So please let me know if you are having issues hearing me, or if Wi-Fi cuts out. I currently live in a house with 40 other people that use the same Wi-Fi, so let me know if there's any glitches. So thanks for the introduction, Corinne. Just to review, I'm a kinesiology PhD student in my 3rd year. I study how physical activity and fitness influence cognition and motor function in children. I have a background in working with children in a variety of settings over the past, it's been about a decade now. So I have taught preschoolers, I have coached, I've been a mentor. And most of my experiences have been with students from communities and schools that have been affected by poverty. A few things that I like to do for fun are working out. I like baking things and cooking. And then I love watching different movies. And then if you're interested in following, I do have an academic Twitter. So that is my Twitter handle if you would like to follow me. And I just wanted to start off with a short anecdote about my time in Boston. So while I was living in Boston and earning my master's, I was also helping out with a local school in Dorchester. So if you're familiar with the Boston area, Dorchester is in the southern part of the city. I worked at a school that was for students who were performing lower than their peers, or students who were from low income communities who might have needed a little bit more support and a little bit more or more resources for their academics. And I was asked to work there because a lot of the teachers expressed concerns over not having enough physical activity opportunities. So I worked with them on implementing physical activity breaks into various classrooms. And so this topic is a little bit personal for me because I did have experience working in a school that was affected by these PE cuts as well as recess cuts. So that's just a little background about me. And so today we'll talk about why physical education or PE opportunities in schools are important. I'll do a short timeline on PE implementation in schools. We'll talk about the rates and the recommendations of physical activity and the PE curriculum. Then we'll talk about trends and aftermath of PE budget cuts. And then finally, we'll talk about how we can implement PE or physical activity opportunities in policy as well as at schools, more so, and then at home. So starting with just defining what physical education is, I know for some people, depending on when you went to school and what type of school you went to, it might be a little bit different. But overall, it's just a curriculum that's put into schools to teach children cognitive content and instruction designed to develop their motor skills that are related to sport and fitness related activities, develop their knowledge and their behaviors towards physical activity and fitness. And so my first audience question is, I just want to know how everyone's PE experience was while they were in school. Was it positive, negative, neutral? You can use different words like great, fantastic, horrible, hated it. I hope no one hated it, but just want to get an idea of where everybody was at in terms of school. And actually, Corinne, I can't see the chat. Oh, let me try to read. Sorry. Corinne, are you able to see the chat?
Yep, we've got a good mix of neutral, a mix, positive,
Okay. You
very
might have to tell
positive.
me because I can't see the chat.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so a good mix of positive, neutral.
I'd say most are positive.
Okay, that's good. Okay, great. Maybe we have some people that are passionate about this, and that's why we're at this talk. And so a lot of researchers have studied people's PE experiences. And then in a larger study on about 1,000 adults, they asked them different questions about their past PE experiences and how that they wanted to know how those experiences affected adults' current physical activity participation and attitudes. And so when they asked them these questions, most of them were open-ended, and the researchers then took their responses and discovered different themes that fit into a positive category and a negative category. And so we'll start with the positive themes. So based off of everyone's responses, they found 3 major positive themes. And those were enjoyment, so just simply having fun during PE, physical competence. So that goes back to teaching children those motor skills that you need to participate in sport and physical activity. And the non-participation, which I think is debatable on whether that's positive or negative, because most that theme was people saying that they were happy that they got out of PE in some way. They either were hurt and couldn't participate, or they were given an opportunity to do a different subject instead of PE. And so that was one of the main positive memories. So I wouldn't encourage non-participation, but that was one of the themes. And then for negative memories, that came down to 6 different themes. And so that was mainly embarrassment during PE. And the embarrassment is likely coming from lack of physical competence. So if you're not able to do the activities, of course, amongst your peers, that can be embarrassing. And that can also lead to a lack of enjoyment of PE, people reporting bullying, having injuries, of course. There's always a risk of injury when you're being physically active. Having anxiety about physique. So that's common in women and adolescent girls, is having that physique anxiety. And then also using PE as a punishment. So if you can't shoot a basket this many times for basketball, then they would be told that they had to run a mile or something. That's what one person reported. And so that's definitely not a good memory that we want surrounding PE. And so what the researchers did is they took these memories and then they did analyses to see how these memories related to current physical activity rates and attitudes. And what they found was the most substantial memory was the memory of enjoyment, and that was related to present day attitudes and intentions to be active, so in a positive way. And that was also significantly related to more days of participating in moderate and vigorous leisure time activity and less time sitting during the weekdays and the weekends. Um, and then the next most common memory to be related to current physical activity trends was a negative memory, and that was being chosen first infrequently or being chosen last often. So I'm sure we've all experienced when there were two teams, you had to pick a team and no one wants to be picked last. And so that memory was negatively related to attitudes and intentions to be active. So people who reported that often were less likely to be or less likely to intend to be active. And then it also was related to more time spent sitting during the weekdays and the weekends. And so this study shows us that PE experiences are not just experiences that we forget during childhood, they're experiences that can have long lasting impacts into adulthood. So it's important to promote those positive themes and positive behaviors during PE. The bright side that came from this study is that when you were looking at the analyses that they reported on, the positive memory relationships were stronger and occurred more often than the negative memory relationships, meaning that there was likely a bigger emphasis and bigger influence coming from positive memories than from negative memories. So that's a good thing. Um, and so I want to quickly go over why physical activity is important beyond these positive and negative memories. And so the first is just having a break from class time. So breaking up that sedentary time. Many studies have shown that breaking up sedentary time, even with very short bouts of physical activity, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, have shown improvements. And then breaking up cognitive demands of being in school. So having to pay attention for a really long time, having to think and use higher order processing for math or reading. And then having to, for some kids, it's very difficult. I'm this way a little bit, is having to keep quiet for a long amount of time. So providing that break is really important for kids. Um, and then improving physical health, of course, this is something that many of us know. I've done talks with the community seminar series in the past about these improvements in physical health. And so just quickly, improvements of fitness, better weight status throughout childhood, which is important because weight status during childhood is predictive of weight status during adulthood. Better sleep. I'm sure if we have any teachers or parents in the audience right now, they would really appreciate if their children were sleeping better and sleeping more often. And then, of course, improvements in metabolic health. And this is really to decrease children's risk of having metabolic disorders later in life. So decreased risk of type 2 diabetes, decreased risk of any type of cardiovascular event or cardiorespiratory disease. Next would be improvements in cognitive skills. This is fairly new in terms of the research. It started maybe like the 80s and 90s, but it's really ramped up in the 2000s. And so physical activity has been shown to improve children's executive functions. So those are those functions that help us with higher order processing, paying close attention to something, switching back and forth between tasks, also being able to hold memory better, so improvements in memory. And then those functions are crucial for academic performance. So math, reading and writing skills, scientific learning, and so on. And then lastly, this is a benefit that's not talked about as much, but still very, very important. And that's improvements in children's social skills. So many physical activity interventions have shown that children improve in their social and emotional skills when they're interacting with each other in the sports setting, exposing them to a variety of activities that they can do outside of school as well as in adulthood. They have the opportunity to learn leadership skills and build teamwork skills with each other. And then finally, improvements in self-confidence, competence, and responsibility. And so these are skills that honestly I think is worth its own talk, but we'll just touch on them a little bit today. And so just a review on the importance of physical activity. Having a brain break is great, especially for kids who cannot pay attention and focus for a very long time. Um, Improvements in physical and cognitive health, and then also improvements in social skills. So now we'll quickly go over the timeline of how kind of PE entered into our school system and what is going on nowadays. So back in the 1800s, the US implemented PE into schools to train soldiers for battle. Late 1800s, we have Civil War, and then a few decades later, we have World War I and World War II. And so PE is really focused on training men and boys to be able to fight in battle. Um, Later in the 1900s, PE takes a more health and fitness related approach, less militarized and more focused on improving fitness. And then you start to see colleges adopt PE as a curriculum. So people who took PE in high school can continue to take it in college, and as well as major in physical education so they can become PE teachers later in adulthood. Later in the 90s, or in the 1900s, excuse me, we see a rise in obesity amongst adults and children, and then a decrease in physical activity rates. And then in the 2000s, we start to see how states and policies are putting greater emphasis on academic and standardized test performance. Schools start to feel the pressure of increasing time in the classroom in order to get funding. And at the same time, we have this emergence of research on physical activity and cognition and academics. So what's going on in the 2000s, it seems that there's some conflicting goals here. So schools and states are really want to push academics, but in higher education, we see a lot of research saying, well, hold on, physical activity can actually improve these academics. So now we're dealing with this conflicting issue right now. What also happens in the 2000s is the emergence of recommendations and guidelines surrounding physical activity. So in 2008 is when the first physical activity guidelines for Americans came out. It was recently updated in 2018. So for children 6 to 17 years old, it's recommended that they participate in 60 minutes a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And then we have also the National Association for Sport and Physical Education. So these kind of go hand in hand because what this sport and physical education entity is recommending is for almost half of the guidelines to be met at school. So for elementary students, they recommend 150 minutes a week of PE. And then for secondary schools, for adolescents, so that's middle school and high school, they recommend even more, so 225 minutes per week of PE. And there could be a lot of reasons why they're recommending more. I have a feeling it's because there's quite a bit of growth going on because of puberty in middle school and high school. And so physical activity kind of helps with that growth. And then also adolescents tend to participate in less physical activity than children. So as children age from 6 to 17, physical activity participation goes down. And so it's possible that these secondary recommendations are to counteract that lack of participation later in life. So what we know right now is that depending on the study that you look at, the amount of children meeting these guidelines is only about a quarter of our children in the US. And like I said previously, most of that is likely coming from those elementary age children. And so we'll also talk about who is participating in those recommendations from the National Sport and Physical Education entity. So just quickly put in the chat, how many states do you think require 150 minutes per week of physical education in elementary schools? So I'll give you all a second to try to guess. And Corinne, if you don't mind telling me what those are.
Got 1, 10, 5, 2,
Okay. Okay, so some pretty
40,
good guesses. 40.
8,
Um,
30.
okay. So it's actually 3 that require. And this is according to Shape America. And this is the key word here is require. So some states do recommend. I think the recommendation that comes from states is closer to about half of our states have this recommendation, but only 3 actually require, and that's New Jersey, Florida, and Louisiana. And then in terms of the secondary schools, we'll do same question. How many states do you all think require this for middle school and high school?
0 was the first response.
Mhm.
Another 0, 3, 2, 3, 5.
Better guesses this time.
Yeah. Once you see the first one, it
Yeah. So it's also 3. It's different states. It's West Virginia, Utah, and Montana. Um, why is it different states? I'm not sure. They might have their priorities in just in different places. But yeah, we only have 3 states for each recommendation that require this. Like I said, some states have the recommendation of doing that, and then they leave it up to the district or the school to be able to meet them. And if they can't, it's just fine because it's only a recommendation. So if you are interested in pushing for this to be a requirement, particularly in Illinois, I'm assuming most of us are from Illinois, except for I saw someone was from Nebraska. Then I encourage getting involved in policy to make this a requirement. And then a few more quick facts surrounding PE policy in the United States. So only 75% of our states actually require PE for K through 12. So that doesn't mean that, 25% of our states don't have any PE. It just means that they don't require it for K through 12. They might only require it, for K through 5, or it might just be a recommendation. And then a few more facts is that 28 of our states allow for PE exemptions. I went to a school in high school, they allowed juniors and seniors to be exempt from PE if they wanted to take more classes for college, or if they had a job, or really if they just wanted to leave school early. They just let us not take PE. Only 22 states require to allot a specified amount of time. So they require that 150 minutes, or they require 30 minutes a day. So that specified time is crucial. And then only 10 states designate funding for professional development of PE teachers. And I'll get back to the professional development, but that's can be a concern for many PE teachers for a variety of reasons. Okay, so now we'll talk about the budget cuts. So I don't have specifics on numbers because it's heavily reliant on the district and the state, but we will kind of talk about overall budget cuts, kind of what happens and the results. So like I said, the 2000s is when there's greater emphasis put on schools regarding academics. So school budgets have decreased depending on the state. And incentives have been put in place for schools to improve their academics in order to earn a larger budget. And this is actually seen not only in elementary and secondary schools, but also in higher education. There's a lot of incentives for colleges to show that their academics are doing really well to get more state funding. So what happens when the school budget in general goes down and there's incentives for academics? Usually the first to go is the PE teachers. And so there have been hundreds of thousands of layoffs between 2000 and 2020 regarding PE teachers being laid off. And what happens because of that is PE class size can go up. So instead of one teacher teaching 1 first grade class, that teacher might be teaching 3 first grade classes all at the same time. Or what they would do is decrease the amount of time per PE class. So if all the first graders had 30 minutes of PE, and then there's a cut in teachers, now maybe they only have 20 minutes of PE because they have to fit in more classes for the same teacher. There's also less money to buy equipment. There's also spacing issues. So smaller schools with less money tend to share their cafeteria and their gym space. That's common in the Urbana-Champaign area. And that can be problematic for trying to fit in PE class because half the day there's kids in there eating lunch. And so you don't have a full day to fit in enough PE time. And then finally, less people with some type of physical education certification or physical activity training certification in the schools. And so the result of these PE budget cuts should be improvements in academics. And so the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, reports every few years on scores from standardized tests that kids all over the country take. And they recently, in 2020, released changes between 1971, 2012, and 2020. And I focused on the reading and math scores because those are actually the subjects that tend to be most consistently related to physical activity participation and physical activity interventions. And so we'll start with reading. And so for 9-year-olds between 1971 and 2020, we have a 12-point increase, which is great. But between 2012 and 2020, we don't see any change in reading scores, meaning that this increase from 1971 to 2020 likely came before the 2000s. Similar-ish pattern with the 13-year-olds is that we have an increase between 1971 and 2020. But we unfortunately have a decrease between 2012 and 2020. So we have this increase all the way up until 2012. And then something happens between 2012 and 2020 and their reading scores go down. And then we have pretty much the same exact pattern for math, except the points are greater. So from 1971 to 2020, you have a 22-point increase overall for 9-year-olds. And then no change from 2012 to 2020 in terms of math scores. And then for the 13-year-olds, you have an increase from 1971 to 2020, but a decrease from 2012 to 2020. So what this chart is telling us is that we have improvements in children's academics from the 70s up until now, which is great. Although it appears that a lot of that increase came before at least 2012. And so we can dissect this more in a different talk, but there's a variety of reasons why this could be happening. The school budget cuts are usually the main culprit of these score changes. And I do also want to preface that this is just one entity that looks at students' educational progress. There's many other national and international entities. For example, an international entity found that reading scores did not change between 2000 and 2018 for children in the US. And they also pointed out that children of higher socioeconomic status that have more resources are improving and were improving and still are. And then children that have less resources and less access are staying the same or getting worse in terms of their performance. So what we're also seeing is increase in the gap between high performers and low performers in schools. And then we also have changes in health behaviors. So these health behaviors are not directly linked to PE, but they are occurring concurrently with PE changes and budget cuts. And so, and they can be mitigated if PE policy and time in PE were to change. So the first is increases in weight status. increases in sedentary time, and then also an increase in the diagnoses of attention disorders. And so um, the weight status and sedentary time are more directly related to lack of physical activity opportunities. The attention disorders, it could be that we're getting better at identifying these disorders, especially at an earlier age. Although attention disorders have also been studied in the physical activity world, and physical activity interventions have shown to improve behaviors that come from these attention disorders. And then we see decreases in nutrition status at schools. It's possible because of budget cuts. We see decreases in physical activity, and then particularly decreases in sport participation in adolescence. And the sport participation in adolescence is seen more so in females than in males. It also is related to PE and sport experiences. So children who may have had a poor PE experience, or maybe did a sport where they kind of overdid it during childhood, they're more likely to quit that sport in adolescence and suffer from burnout. And then on top of cuts, we unfortunately have been going through a pandemic. And so the COVID-19 pandemic has shown in many studies that it has exacerbated health issues that were already occurring. And many of us have heard about increases in or decreases in mental health, poorer physical health in adults and in children. But I kind of wanted to focus on the PE teachers, because they are the ones that are educating our students and our kids and giving them those opportunities. So in a study that conducted in May of 2020, they asked teachers all over the country. It was 4,000 teachers, and it was a pretty even split in terms of urban, suburban, rural, and also a pretty even split in terms of Northeast, Southeast, Midwest, West area. So they have a pretty good array of teachers that answered questions about the success, barriers, professional development, and concerns surrounding PE virtually. And their responses came down to 3 different themes. So the first theme is a positive one. So many teachers reported some proud moments, which are good to highlight. So the first is their ability to create good content, particularly virtually. Many teachers reported on being able to overcome learning new technology for their students, and then being able to engage students in online learning was exciting for them. Although those proud moments also had some obstacles. And so the first obstacle was concerns over lack of participation. So many teachers reported having a hard time holding their students accountable. They would require students to send in videos or submit assignments, and they wouldn't do it. And the schools or the districts or the states also made it difficult because PE either was never part of their grade in the first place, or during the pandemic became something that was not part of their grade. And so there's obviously not much of an incentive if you aren't given a grade, or the grade changed from a letter grade to satisfactory or unsatisfactory. So kind of that pass fail situation. Teachers also reported on issues meeting the needs of all their students. So this was mainly people in rural areas, people in the South, and then people who worked with children who didn't have as many resources at home. So I'm sure people in the surrounding Urbana-Champaign area could share some similar issues, because you need the internet to do virtual learning. And so not having internet access, not having a computer at home, not knowing how to use it. So teachers were struggling with having students in classrooms with all different at-home lives. And then lastly, the need for additional professional development emerged during the pandemic. Although many teachers in this study, I have this starred because that many teachers in this study reported that this need for additional professional development was a need before the pandemic, and then it just became worse during the pandemic. And like I said before, only 10 states require some type of or provide funding for some type of professional development for PE teachers. And so we're seeing now with the pandemic that this is an issue that can become exacerbated. And then finally, some upcoming challenges. So this was done in 2020. So obviously in May of 2020, no one knew what the pandemic was going to look like. So there was this fear of the unknown. And I wouldn't be surprised if are still teachers and parents that are still anxious about what's going to happen in the fall and not sure what to prepare for. And then obviously there was concerns over teaching with social distancing and masks. But I don't know how you could play PE games socially distant. So I commend those teachers for figuring that out. And then also concerns over the safety of the students, obviously not wanting to, spread this virus. And then obviously trying to think of what their home life is if they're doing virtual PE and how they can stay safe at home, but also be active. So now we'll talk about how some changes can be made policy-wise, as well as in the classroom and at home. So policy-wise, it's important to include evidence-based elements in policy. And these elements these are just 4 elements that are considered evidence-based, although there are other evidence-based elements, but I'm focusing on these 4 because they're very specific and I think cover kind of the overall goals of PE. So the first evidence-based element is increasing minutes of PE. So providing a specified amount of time spent in PE. Like I said before earlier, only 22 states require a specific amount of time in PE. So increasing that would be great. Also including moderate or vigorous activities. So using those terms and doing activities that kids can reach those intensities at. And that's most sports, to be honest. Soccer, basketball, football, baseball can get you up into those intensities. Another policy or evidence-based policy could be something surrounding teacher certification or some type of professional development. And then finally, another component of a policy could be improving the environment of PE. So providing certain facilities or equipment for PE. So in a study conducted in 2008, they assessed how many bills nationwide were introduced that included these evidence-based elements. So in 2008, they looked retrospectively between 2001 and 2007, and they found that the number of bills introduced for increasing minutes was 178. For inclusion of that high intensity, it's 43. For teacher certification, 55. And then for improving PE environments, it's 78. And so those were the bills that were introduced. In terms of which ones were actually enacted between 2001 and 2007, we see the highest number of bills enacted were 11 out of the 43 that were including moderate or vigorous. So that was only about 25% of the bills enacted, or of the bills introduced were enacted. And then the other elements were lower than that. So we see 16% of the increasing minutes in teacher certification and only 10% of the environmental policies. And so this is a graph that shows how many bills were introduced, how many were evidence-based, and then how many of those were enacted between 2001 and 2007. So this is kind of like right after the No Child Left Behind Act is enacted, and kind of the what's going on right after that. And so what we see is, in terms of all bills being introduced, we have this uptick further into the 2000s, And then at the most in 2005, we have 200. And so those are all PE related bills introduced. Next, we have this triangle graph, and then that's showing us how many of those bills included at least one evidence-based element. And so it's about half for each year. So for example, in 2001, almost 80 of the almost 80 bills were introduced, but only half of those had evidence-based elements in them. And then this square line underneath that is all the bills that were enacted. So these are regardless if they have evidence-based elements or not. And so we have even less amount that are enacted. And then right below this circle is what is to me the most important, is how many bills that were enacted that were evidence-based. And for some years it's 0. And then for the other years, we're not even getting up to 20. And so that's important because we want to include research-based and evidence-based policy for PE. So if you are involved or you want to be involved, make sure that you are really pushing for these evidence-based bills. So now we'll talk about changes that can be made in the classroom. To be honest, I didn't want to focus too much on this because I think that we ask teachers to do a lot already. And so these are just some suggestions, but I do think that PE policy and things at home can make a much bigger difference than putting even more pressure on our beloved teachers. So the first thing is just making an active classroom. So that can be having active lessons, active breaks between lessons, having a dynamic classroom. I have a few friends that are teachers that depending on the subject, their students sit in different parts of the classroom or different tables. And so that gives the kids a chance between each subject to stand up and move around. And then not using physical activity as a form of punishment and this can be done in 2 ways. So sometimes people, I think this is a little outdated, but there have been reports of children getting in trouble, and then because they're in trouble, they have to do a certain amount of push-ups or run a mile or something. So let's not put that negative attitude or tone around physical activity. And then you can also do it in the reverse. So do not remove physical activity in the form of punishment. So if a child is acting up, don't take away their recess or don't take away their PE time, find a different way to kind of handle that situation. And then also as a teacher, you can just be a role model and have a positive attitude towards being physically active and encouraging your kids to be physically active or your students to be physically active. And then in terms of making an active classroom, I do have a resource at the end of this slide that can provide you with different ideas. So next we'll be making changes in the home. So this can be very beneficial. A lot of physical activity interventions are family-based, and those seem to be the ones that are the most successful. So I definitely encourage any parents in the home or parents in this talk to try to improve physical activity at home. So the first would be encouraging active transport. So walking or biking to school, or if you live close to the store, you could walk or bike to the store, to a friend's house, etc. But just encouraging your kids to be active when they're going somewhere. That's a really easy way to fit in your physical activity. And then the next is just education on the physical activity guidelines. I did do a talk before with the community seminars about enhancing physical activity opportunities in the home through the physical activity guidelines. And if you just look these up, they give you not only what the recommendations are, but they give you suggestions on how you can meet the physical activity guidelines. And then next would be getting involved in your community and at school. So obviously joining the parent-teacher association or parent-teacher organization at your school if you have time, and kind of pushing for more physical activity opportunities. And then if you don't have time to attend those meetings or be involved, but you do have time to kind of work with your child's teacher. So just sending them an email and saying, you know, I think it would be great if you, if we could do this, if you work from home, or if you are a stay-at-home parent and you have time to come into the school and give the teacher a break and, you know, and do a physical activity break for your child's class, that would be great. That's what I did when I was living in Boston, and the teachers really appreciated it. And then also just getting your neighbors together and have neighborhood, physical activity groups, putting your kids in sports and whatnot. And so before we get to the conclusion, considering we are in Illinois and we have mainly Illinoisans in this audience usually, I wanted to give you all some fast facts about physical education or physical activity in our schools here in Illinois. So the first is that Illinois as a state requires a minimum of 3 out of 5 days be allotted towards physical education, but they do not have a specific time requirement as a state. There may be certain districts that put in their own time requirement. I do think some districts recommend that 150 minutes per week, but this is where we're at for Illinois' requirements for PE. Recently, last summer, Illinois passed a law requiring that public schools provide 30 minutes of unstructured play for kindergarten through 5th grade. So that's great that they're implementing that policy on a state level. So now every district in the state is required to, I'm assuming this unstructured play is recess. So to provide that 30 minutes of recess for elementary kids. And then finally, the 2022 Illinois State Board of Education increased their funding to support instruction in core subjects, and physical education was considered a core subject, which is great. In a lot of other places, the core subjects are math, reading and writing, and science, and physical education is not considered a core subject. So I'm glad to see that Illinois does consider PE as a core subject and is increasing funding to go towards that. So just to conclude, PE experiences and exposures have been shown to have lifelong effects in terms of physical activity participation. And then while many states and districts have attempted to cut PE and enhance academics, there's been little to no improvements in those core academic subjects. But we have seen recently some negative consequences, and that's increased weight status and decreased activity, decreased nutrition status and all that. COVID-19, unfortunately, has exacerbated any existing issues surrounding physical education in schools. But we know that changes can be made in the classroom, at home, and in policy surrounding PE. Here are a few resources that I think would be great. So the first 3 are just bringing in activity either into the classroom or at home. So the creating an active classroom and creating an active home, those 2 websites have so many opportunity videos, PDFs, instructions, activities. So those are 2 great resources if you'd like to use those for anything at home or in the classroom. The next one is Illinois Student Voices. I did put a star by this one because it's very interesting. So it's basically an opportunity for high school students, so rising sophomores, juniors, and seniors, to get involved in the Illinois State Board of Education and be part of a group that advocates for any concerns that they have as students. So I think it's great that that Illinois does that, and they are taking applications this summer for the next school year. So if you know any high school students that you think that would do well with this or are interested in policy, I would direct them to this website. We also have the Illinois report card. So that reports on academics and demographics for each district, although it does not have PE or fitness in there. And so if anyone wants to advocate for them to include PE reports in their Illinois report card, that would be great. I think that that's important. And then the last 2 are just kind of general information regarding policy and advocacy about physical education. So it's just the Illinois State Board of Education, and then Shape America is more nationwide. And so I will take any questions.
Feel free to put any questions you guys have for Shelby in the chat box, and then I can go ahead and get those forwarded on to her.
And then Corinne, do you want me to put the QR code up now?
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah, so we do have a survey for you guys to fill out. That just takes a few minutes so that we can hopefully continue to provide some up-to-date evidence-based information for you guys in the next coming semesters or seasons. Oh, and then if you are here for CEUs or CPDUs, you can register, or you can click the link that Dee just put in the chat to register and pay for your CEUs there. And the survey link is also in the chat box in that same bubble that they sent over. Lots of thank yous and good job, Shelby.
Yeah, I can't see the chat. I don't know why I can't see it, but it's okay.
Awesome. And then next week will be our last week for the spring, but I think there will be some presentations starting back up in the summer, so make sure you keep an eye out for an email for registration for that.